All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Garrett Naiman, and I'm a recent graduate, this last May, from the doctoral program in International Multicultural Education in the School of Ed. It is an absolute honor and pleasure to be here tonight. I look for any way I can hang around the School of Ed, even though I've graduated, so I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm also thrilled because students like me decided to pursue their higher education in international multicultural education and the School of Education here specifically at the University of San Francisco because of the dedication within the programs and the department and the school to not just the studying of education, but praxis and seeing social justice through from the ivory tower to the streets. And so to be able to speak here tonight to introduce a very special guest is an honor because he upholds the values that are the reason we study here at the School of Ed at USF. So I want to introduce him. Dr. David Stovall is a professor of educational policy studies and African American studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His scholarship investigates 4 areas: critical race theory, concepts of social justice and education, the relationship between housing and education, and the relationship between schools and community stakeholders. In the attempt to bring theory to action, he has spent the last 10 years working with community organizations and schools to develop curriculum that addresses issues of social justice. His current work led him to become a member of the design team for the Greater Lawndale Little Village School of Social Justice, which opened in the fall of 2005. Furthering his work with communities, students, and teachers, Stovall is involved with youth-centered community organizations in Chicago, New York, and the Bay Area right here. Currently, this work manifests itself in his involvement with the People's Education Movement Chicago, a collection of classroom teachers, community members, students, and university professors who engage in collaborative community projects centered in creating relevant classroom-based pedagogical strategies and curriculum. In addition to his duties and responsibilities as a professor at UIC, he also serves as a volunteer social studies teacher at the Greater Lawndale Little Village School for Social Justice. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome up to the stage Dr. David Stovall.
Peace and greetings, y'all. I come this way from Chicago, and for all the Giants fans, no worries. I am not a Cubs fan. I am a Southsider, right? So we wanna be clear about that. That's our regionalism that we have to make sure is clear. One of the things that, before I get to introduce you all's dean, one of the things that I wanted to put forward that we don't get a lot of mention of is 50 years ago this month at a place called Lake Merritt College, an organization known as the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was created. So I always want to show honor in the place that I am in remembering their struggle and their current struggle, right? So right now we are in a dramatic moment, an interesting moment, but dramatic nonetheless, right? And one that actually exceeds our current electoral debate. So being from Chicago, we have had 3,000 shootings, 500 homicides since January 1. Now, what does that mean in a city that spends 50% of its budget on police? What does that mean in a city that currently has fired 1,000 teachers and is now proposed to hire 1,000 cops? So now, what does it mean on the verge of a strike that could potentially be long-term? So now I bring this to you all as a Chicagoan, but to think about what you all have here in San Francisco. Now, you all have something very different than what we have in Chicago and what we've never had in Chicago. So Chicago, since its founding in 1833 and its establishment and incorporation in 1837, has never had a locally elected school board. Right? It has never had one. So now you all have one, but you have a locally elected school board in a city that has more registered dogs than it does high school age or school age young people. So I'm always saying to myself, this is a certain situation here, right? So now, what does this mean? And I think for school space and for you all talking to potential board members, what does this mean in a city that has become unlivable? And just like what it means in a place like Chicago, that in many places have been disinvested, abandoned, marginalized, and isolated, right? So for folks who are interested to see more about this, I see our brother Jeremiah here. Please attend Saturday, the Teachers for Social Justice Conference at Mission High School. It is a place where you need to be, right? I always come here every year. I've been coming since the inception. I come because Jeff Duncan Andrade always reminds me that a good teacher is a good thief, right? So I come every year to San Francisco to steal something and take back to my young folks in Chicago because there are folks here who are grappling with this. Now, let's talk a little bit about this electoral thing. One person has no clue about anything. Let's be clear. Right? Let's just say it what it is, right? I'm not sure if he knows where he is, right? But the other person is pretty slick. Slick in a particular way that means a lot internationally, and it means a lot in terms of a conversation that we have not had nationally in this particular election cycle around education. Now, when we put those two things together, what does it mean for the future of young folks in schools? Now, my comrade Kevin Kumashiro is going to talk to us a little bit about this, but I say comrade because justice work is something that we often do not engage, right? So Kevin put forward a point in his book, Bad Teacher, that I think we often forget about schools. And every time I say this, everybody thinks I'm being incendiary. But let's take it for what it is. The U.S. schooling system was never intended to educate the masses. Now, when we say that, everybody thinks that that's an indictment on schools and teachers. Think about it a little different. There is a difference between education and school. School is order and compliance. Education is about us making informed decisions that push us towards a justice condition. Now, when we think about teachers, and we always forget this, the teachers that we loved were always in trouble. All right? We always forget this, right? They were in trouble because they were less concerned about school and more concerned about education. And that education allowed us to make very conscious decisions, and they were ill-concerned about the consequences from the state. So now, in this moment, when we're talking about what November the 2nd, the first Tuesday in November will mean, I'm much more concerned about what Wednesday will mean, right? And what will Wednesday be when Wednesday becomes Thursday, Friday, Saturday for the next 4 years, right? And then we got more stuff to grapple about, but more importantly, what is it that we're doing? And how are we committed to make these things happen? Again, I say these things to you in a city that is on fire, not because of the 3,000 shootings and 500 homicides, on fire because a mayor has actually claimed a certain population of people disposable. And he has moved in every way to demonstrate their disposability. So now, with my comrade Kevin Kumashiro, not only am I charged with introducing him, but I also want us to think about what he's challenged us to do, right? He wrote a book called Against Common Sense. And in that, we often think about, every time we see the word common sense, we think about our grandmother's common sense. We're actually talking about that good sense of the state, right? What the state has deemed popular, what the state has deemed necessary, and what the state has deemed that actually runs counter to what we may need in classrooms. So Kevin's work here at the University of San Francisco, previously in Chicago, in creating an organization called the Chicagoland Researchers and Advocates for Transformative Education, CREATE. You all now have a California version of this in a forum like this tonight. I want to shout you all out, and as the young folks say, lift you all up, because this is a space that we often do not see. And also, Kevin has also challenged us to say, well, what does it mean to talk about things like inclusion, diversity? And how do we trouble those comments, right? Because here's the thing. We say this stuff and we see all these buzzwords, and I'm often fearful when people even say stuff like social justice. What are we talking about? Justice for whom and on whose terms? And then on those terms, how are we willing to now think about equity, meaning that some folks need different things at different times? So an equitable understanding of this will now take us to rethink. So I'm always appreciative of Dean Kumashiro's capacity to challenge us to rethink these things that we've taken to be normal. And again, that term in and of itself is problematic, because now what we really start to figure out, and scientists have said this for quite some time, this word normal makes no sense. There's no such thing. Now, because there isn't, what do we do? And I think Kevin's work has pushed us forward to talk about these things that we do that will be challenging for some of us to grapple with. I like working with young folks because young folks have the smallest bullshit meter on the planet, right? They're going to tell you when something is not working. They're going to tell you when something is wrong. They're going to push back, right? But then as adults, we try to control that. When my students ask, why we got to do this? I'm always saying, that is an excellent question. Why do we have to do this, right? What machinations of the state has propelled us to be in this moment during 8th period when somebody just told you that they liked you, right? And we got to be in social studies. What does that mean, right? And how do we actually start to engage that? And this year, I'm super happy because I got 5th period. Yo, that is like the heaven period, right? Because it's right before lunch. So now you can actually get a little goal orientation. All right, just stay with me for a little bit. You're about to eat, right? So that's the justice condition in many ways. So I always think about Kevin's work as one that challenges us to go beyond this normative understanding and to rethink what it is that we're going to do tomorrow. Because a lot of times we get so pressed up on these current moments, but we very rarely think about what is our work long term. How do we become, as our elders talk about, long distance revolutionaries and not reactionaries? So now, when we start to think about that work, I think about Kevin's challenges, and I am pleased and humbled to introduce him tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dean Kevin Kumashiro.
That was incredibly humbling. Thank you. It's always, I have to remind myself not to schedule events where I have to follow David Stovall because very bright and inspiring and energizing, and I so appreciate your work. I wanted to point out that Dr. Stovall is the author of a new book that just came out. It's called Born Out of Struggle: Critical Race Theory, School Creation, and the Politics of Interruption. And he'll be speaking at an event tomorrow at iSeed Oakland. So if you Googled ISEEED, you'll see that an event is happening tomorrow at 7 p.m. I hope you will all be there to hear him speak in much more detail about his work and to celebrate this new resource. A lot of thank yous. I just want to acknowledge everyone who's in the room. We have public leaders, university trustees, special guests. We have the school district leaders and educators. The co-sponsor of this event is the McCarthy Center for Public Service and the Common Good. We have Board of Education candidates who are tabling outside. Voter registration is here, the USF bookstore is here, and this event is possible because of the amazing staff of the School of Education: Amy Fogliani, Lisa Klope, Miranda Calderon, Allison Rodriguez, and Shabnam Koirala Azad. A special thanks to Melissa Shriver. Is Melissa here yet?
when she's here, I hope you all have a chance to meet her. She flew in from Los Angeles to come to this event. She's the executive director of an organization called Turnaround Arts California. I was recently being interviewed by, I forgot who was interviewing me, but someone was interviewing me and asked me, what is a model for kind of school improvement that pushes against what we see so often today in the United States? And I said an amazing model is actually the Turnaround Arts model. It's not about closing down schools because some say they struggle. It's about building the capacity of schools, rallying a community around it, and it's about saying that the arts, rather than being the first thing to cut, should actually be the centerpiece of that reform. I thank all of you who are here tonight for coming, all who are joining us virtually from afar. At the end of the lecture, I want to point out that there's going to be more time to meet the candidates, to register to vote. There will be a book sale and book signing. Dave and I will be sitting outside. We also came out with a new book recently. I think it was earlier this year. So please check that out. And I also want to mention that some board candidates wanted to be here, were not able to be here, so please pick up the information sheet so that you have a chance to learn about all of the people who are running for the San Francisco Board of Education. So now my presentation. So I want to speak tonight about education and the November election. And what I hope you walk away with at the end of my presentation is a keen sense of responsibility, or a keen understanding that how the next president shapes, makes, or breaks public education has everything to do with how we as a people shape the next president. I'm actually going to say very little about the candidates. What I want to do is talk about the significance of this election for education, and I'm going to group my comments into 5 sections. So the first theme I want to talk about is transformative leaders and the power of social movements. Transformative leaders and the power of social movements. So we're approaching an election. As Dave kind of mentioned, the rhetoric is nothing short of terrifying in many ways. You can listen to the top 3 candidates from the Republicans, the Democrats, and the Green Party. And you actually, while there's many things that differentiate these candidates, there are some things that tie them all together. One thing that we hear across all candidates is that the world is a dangerous place and that I can make us stronger and safer, unlike my opponents, right? And there's different ways that we define the danger. There's different ways that we define how I will make this country better, but that is absolutely one of the common messages we're hearing. In other words, characterizing this election is a lot of sense of fear. With some candidates, there's also a great sense of hate. There's a lot of hateful sentiment coming, whether it's about immigrants or about people of color or about women or about LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people, people with disabilities, and so on. And there's very little substance in the mainstream media that challenges this very problematic rhetoric. In fact, often what we hear is more about why we should vote against someone rather than why we should be voting for something. So there are many of us who look with much despair, who fight feelings of despair by looking for reasons for hope. Hope as we wonder, what is it that we want to tell young people in the midst of such fear rhetoric and hate rhetoric? So this searching for hope reminds me of 8 years ago when Barack Obama was running. One of his slogans was, "Yes, we can," and there was definitely a sense of hopefulness as we elect our first African-American president, and a lot of people were like, wow, he's going to just change everything, right? This reminds me of a conversation that I had at the time of the election with a friend who was like, wow, we should not be expecting one person is going to save us. We should not expect that one person is going to change everything, because doing so sets us up for failure, sets them up for failure, sets us up for disappointment. In fact, this is how I often talk with some of my friends about being a dean. And sometimes the hardest thing about being a dean aren't those who hate the work I do, aren't those who most forcefully oppose it. It's actually those who claim to be a part of it, but are not rallying in the same direction. So now when we look at some of the most transformative presidents in our nation's history, those who were presidents at the time of some of the most significant social changes in this country, we see that they were successful because they had vibrant social movements supporting and pushing them. People like Lincoln, who had the abolitionists, Franklin Roosevelt, who had the labor and left populist movements, Lyndon Johnson, with the civil rights organizations, Reagan with the conservative and Christian right movements. These are not at all presidents who are all the same. Many of them are people I strongly disagree with. But what I will say characterizes all of them is that they were presidents at the time of significant social transformation in this country, and that they were responsible not by themselves, but because they were working in tandem with social movements. So John Atlas, the president and founder of the National Housing Institute, tells us this. He says, Franklin Roosevelt recognized that his ability to push New Deal legislation through Congress depended on the pressure generated by these movements. So for example, when FDR was confronted with activists who were belaboring a point, he said, okay, you've convinced me, now go out and put pressure on me. My point here is that the next president will not be successful if there is not a social movement around that president, one that can push for a vision of social justice, particularly social justice in education. And I would argue the starting place for such a movement, the starting place for such a vision, is the rattling of what has become common sense. So this gets at some of what Dave is talking about. This gets to my second point, common sense and the danger of a single story. Common sense and the danger of a single story. Let me take you back to about fall of 1997. So I was in Hawaii, I was visiting my family, and I remember coming across this newspaper ad. It was a full-page ad, and the headline, which took up about this much space, it was a very big headline. It said, "It's just common sense." So what was this ad about? Well, some of you may remember, fall of '97 was when there was a constitutional amendment on the ballot. The Supreme Court in Hawaii was about to say that there's no compelling state reason to prohibit same-sex marriage. And so many people put on the ballot of Hawaii, giving the state legislature the authority to create a constitutional amendment that gives, on the ballot was creating a constitutional amendment to give the legislature the ability to prohibit same-sex marriage. Okay. So the ad was basically for people who, by people who wanted this amendment, right? It was basically, their argument was, well, it's just common sense that marriage is between a man and a woman, right? This kind of reminds me of how, when we're talking with young people, there are many of educators, I'm sure, sitting in this room, or future educators. We can all think of examples of when one way that we reprimand someone is we say something like, just use your common sense, right? As if what you're doing is stupid, and if you used your common sense, you might do something much smarter, right? As if common sense is a good thing. Okay, hopefully you see that the point of my sharing these two stories is that common sense is not always a good thing. Common sense isn't something that just is. Common sense is something that evolves over time. It is specific to a particular location and group of people and cultural setting, right? Common sense changes from time to time. And what is the function of common sense? The function of common sense is actually to socialize people into that context. It is actually to maintain the status quo. Common sense is not about rattling for social change, right? I like to tell the story about how 100 years ago in this country, it was kind of commonsensical to say that if you were a girl, you should not get too much education. And why did we say that? Well, some people believed that women belonged in the home. Some people believed that women would compete with men for jobs. But there was also a science of the time that was telling us something like this. The mind is connected to the body. And if you mess with one, you might mess with the other. So if girls got too much education, they might go crazy, or they might become physically ill, or they might even become infertile. So today, many of us look back and we say, what? You do too much homework and you can't have babies. Like, who came up with that, right? But my point is that about 100 years ago, for many people, that was just considered common sense. And about 50 years ago, there was a common sense that said, if you had darker skin, you should not get too much education. And why did we say that? Well, some people believed that there would be competition for jobs, but there was also a science of that time that was telling us something like this. If you had darker skin, you did not have as much intellectual capacity. You were not as smart. So why should we waste our time and our resources teaching you? Now today, many of us look back and we say, wow, that's a really racist thing to say. But my point is that about 50 years ago, for many people, and arguably even for some people today, that was just considered common sense. Now, I say this not to poke fun at people 50 or 100 years ago, but rather to raise the question, 50 years from now, how might we complete the sentence, well, I can't believe in 2016 it was commonsensical to think this. Right? What is the common sense of our time that we're not even recognizing is preventing us from seeing what's really going on and what might be better steps forward? There are many things that are commonsensical in education that often go unquestioned. Why do we run the school year from September to June? Why does it run from 8 till 3? Why do we group about 30 or 40 people in a classroom? Why do we teach about 50 minutes of math and 50 minutes of reading a day and so on, right? And in fact, sometimes when we put to public vote these kinds of questions, people often vote them down because they argue that this is not what education has been or should be, even though there's no research that actually tells us that this is what education should look like. These are not ideas based on research. These are ideas based on some sense of what has become taken for granted, some conventional wisdom of our time. So I bring this up because my argument is that certain ideas regarding the problems and the potential for public education have become so commonsensical that they are not even debated. That both, for example, Democrats and Republicans take it up. They embrace it. Our debates are so narrowly defined as to obscure the bigger picture. We're buying into, in other words, only one story. And this reminds me of the fantastic TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie called The Danger of a Single Story. I'm seeing nods, so many of you are familiar, right? Her argument is that every story is partial. Every story is contested. So whether I'm talking about an event or a group or a person, whatever thing it is that I'm talking about, if I believe that there is only one story and everyone should buy into that story, I'm actually preventing us from seeing with much more complexity and accuracy what is actually going on. We should not be insisting that everyone buy into my story. An educated person insists that every story is partial, and my job is to get into that contestation, right? So let me give an example by talking a little bit then about our presidential candidates, because as we know, we hear very little from our presidential candidates, the top ones, about education. But let me tell you a little bit about what we do know. So Trump has put out an education platform that calls for choice. Choice is the centerpiece of Donald Trump's platform. And his argument is that, as with grocery stores in a neighborhood, it's competition that will drive improvement, right? What is the problem? We've become kind of complacent because we are just one system and we're not forced to compete with one another. It's kind of like, one time I was talking to my brother about a chess game, and I like to tell the story, does wanting to beat my brother in chess make me try harder? Yes, it does, right? Competition sometimes does drive improvement, it does drive effort, and it can make things better. The point, however, that I want to make is that it doesn't always lead to improvement, that sometimes it can make things far worse. But that being said, choice is a centerpiece of his platform, and money should be tied to that. So also part of his platform is what's called portability. Portability is where funding can travel to the student. It's sometimes it's called strong choice, where not only do students have the choice, the ability to choose which school they go to, but the funds will travel with them, including to non-public schools, right? He's not calling for more funding. He is calling for a movement away from Common Core state standards. Where does Hillary Clinton stand? She is in favor of Common Core. She is in favor of some form of testing. She's in favor of more money, particularly with early childhood. But where she agrees with Trump is on the call for expanded choice and charter schools. Now, when some people talk about Clinton and Trump, whether they're talking about education or their overall platform, they focus on the differences. They want to say, actually, there's great differences between these two candidates. And in many ways, obviously, there are great differences between these two candidates. But what I want to point out is that there are also a lot of similarities. And why we do not hear about the similarities between candidates is because there aren't third voices entering into the conversation. So the similarities becomes most stark when we look at the platform of someone like Jill Stein from the Green Party. So what is she calling for? She has arguably put out the most detailed platform that aligns most closely with progressive organizations. She's calling for federal funding that's used to equalize funding across schools. She's calling for free education from preschool through higher education. The end of high-stakes testing, not just less of it, but the end of it for students and teachers, movements away from Common Core towards curriculum developed by educators, wraparound services and greater ties to the community, and the end, not the lessening, but the end of privatization. My point here is that sometimes we need help to rattle common sense. Sometimes we need help to look beyond the one single story. We need other lenses, like third voices, to help us see things differently. And so what I want to now do is kind of spend the rest of my talk talking about 3 lenses that I would suggest can help us to rattle common sense and the single story. Things that get us to shift from simplistic understandings of the problem to much more complex and holistic ways of thinking about the solution. I want to propose that we move from single stories to complex pictures, from fixing individuals to fixing systems, and then from debating policies to demystifying ideologies. So the first shift I want to propose is that we shift from single stories to complex pictures. And to do this, let me give as an example the teacher shortage. So not all districts, as I'm learning about Chicago, not everyone is experiencing a teacher shortage, but many would have us believe that we're in a state of crisis in this country right now because districts across the country, for the most part, are short of teachers. This fall, California expected to need 14,000 teachers. San Francisco School District alone needed almost 500. So I was being interviewed last fall about the teacher shortage, and the interviewer began by saying, well, this is about the high cost of living, right? And I was like, yeah, you know, that is a part of it. And I went on to spend 20 minutes talking about how I think there are multiple factors of the teacher shortage. And then I watched the story, and it was all about the cost of living. And I was like, you did not need to interview me. All right. I believe that often we get fixated on one explanation. We get fixated on one single story. The problem, of course, is that there are many factors. A few years ago, when we were talking about kind of the teaching profession, a lot of people seem to be fixated on the idea that the demographic shift is what's going to bring about a shortage, right? We've known this for like over 15 years, that the retiring baby boomer population is going to happen now. And so we should expect that we're going to see a lot of people leaving the profession, and we're going to need a lot more teachers. That seemed to be the dominant story. For this reporter, the high cost of living was a dominant story. And in fact, we then put him in touch with one of our alumni who had recently graduated to tell the story of how she is indeed leaving teaching in the San Francisco public schools because it is impossible to live here, right? Okay. Let me point out, however, about half a dozen other explanations of what's going on. One is salary. One is how we treat the profession, right? I don't know if I need to say more about that. Does everyone know salaries are horrible with the teachers, right? Second is cost of living. And this is, while salary is a problem nationwide, cost of living is very unique to the Bay Area, right? And this is fueled in large part by a number of factors like how corporations, right, bus people back and forth, for example, between San Francisco and other places. Gentrification and the rising cost of living isn't just happenstance. There are things that fuel these changes, right? And it has everything to do with how capitalism operates in this country. Demographic changes like the retiring baby boomer is a third reason. But there's also another reason, which is the pipeline into teaching, right? What is happening right now across the country is a shrinking of the size of the high school population. What we know is that there's actually less people graduating from high school right now. And that will be the case for almost the next decade. What else is happening? About a decade ago, places like California pink slipped thousands of teachers every year. We were getting rid of teachers because we thought we had too many of them, right? We also have these policies that we're putting in place that we're acting as if is a solution, but is actually making things worse. What's one example? We're hiring people who taught for like 2 or 3 decades. I'm sorry, we're seeing retiring people who taught for 2 or 3 decades, and we're replacing them with people who promised to teach only about 2 or 3 years, right? The solution is going to drive, it's going to exacerbate the problem. What else? We're putting into place all sorts of restrictive policies about what it means to teach. I will say, when I talk to teachers, I don't hear that the biggest problem is cost of living. I don't hear that the biggest problem is the retiring population. I hear people say that the biggest problem right now is I can't really do what I believe is good teaching. There are too many reforms underway right now that make it impossible to actually teach, right? And then finally, I would point out that the the problem of the teaching profession isn't simply that it's shrinking right now. The problem is also who constitutes it. And what does that pipeline look like? We have said for decades that the teaching population is over 80% white female. And how do we change that? And it looks like that even in urban settings. And what's the problem? That hasn't changed, right? There is a history of colonialism and heteropatriarchy that compels this demographic through very racialized and gendered policies, practices, and cultural norms. The teacher shortage, then, is a combination of all of this. It is a result of capitalism and gentrification, of demographic changes, the deprofessionalization of teaching, the demonizing of teachers, neoliberalism, colonialism, heteropatriarchy, racism. If you focus on only one, you cannot possibly expect to fix this problem. I know, right? So problematic. All right, let me talk about a second shift that I want to talk about. So that was, let's not focus on single stories, let's look at complex pictures. The second shift I want to talk about is, let's not only try to fix individuals, or let's not try to fix individuals at all, let's try to fix systems. Okay. So how do I want to talk about that? Well, we're in California, and we're still in a drought. I don't know if it's the worst drought in recorded history, but it is the worst restrictions of water usage in this state in our history. So what's going on? Every time we talk about the drought, here's what I hear people say. We need to take shorter showers. We need to turn off the water when we're brushing our teeth. We need to not water the lawn every week. Or, you know, it's all about how we reduce individual consumption. Okay. Well, let's make this interactive. So what percentage of water usage in the state is accounted for by individual household consumption? You all are so, you already know it's supposed to be really low. Okay, so it's clearly not 75, it's clearly not 50, it's clearly not 25 or 10. It's more like around 5, and I think it's even a little bit less than 5%. What is the biggest consumer then of water? It's agriculture, it's agri-commerce, right? It's these huge commercial industries like almonds, which is over 10%, alfalfa, which is over 10%, but the big one, of course, that accounts for about 47% is what? Is cow, right? Is the cow industry. So we're not talking about industry, we're not talking about agribusiness, we're not talking about sort of the economy, we're fixated on the role of the individual. It reminds me of the film An Inconvenient Truth. Everyone remember that? It's made by the same person who made Waiting for Superman, by the way. So The Inconvenient Truth was made about 10 years ago. It's about climate change. Do we know what that is about? Hopefully it's not a fire alarm. All right, it's done. Okay, so as someone was listening, it's like the, you know, the cow industry was like, stop talking about us. So, Inconvenient Truth, right? It's about climate change, and it's featured Al Gore, those of you who remember this film. So I was loving about 99% of this film until the very end. Does everyone remember the very end of this film? It's a black screen with scrolling things coming up, and it's all about what can you do to address climate change, right? So we've just spent like over an hour watching about the systemic, structural, societal causes of climate change, but then we spend all this time hearing about how you need to turn off your lights, and you need to use fluorescent bulbs, and, you know, use public transportation. It's all about individual consumption. When we fixate on individual consumption, we lose sight of what's really a broken system. And in fact, there's this great book by Naomi Klein called This Changes Everything, which makes exactly this argument, right? That the culprit of climate destruction is not the individual, it's actually capitalism. Now let's apply this to education, because at a conceptual level, this is exactly what's happening in education. We're not paying attention to the system. We're focusing instead on blaming individuals. There was this great study that was done a few years ago that wanted to see how does kind of the general population think about education. And so they were asking people, when you hear words like education or schooling, what comes to mind? And what they found was that very commonly a visual image would come to people's minds. It was the image that would look basically like what's happening in this room. That education consists of a bunch of people sitting learning and someone at the front teaching. Well, if that's your image, then when I start talking about problems of education, how do we conceptualize that? Well, what happens is we map on the concept of the problem to the embodiment of the educator. Right? It's easy, in other words, to talk about the problem of education, by immediately thinking about the teacher. We individualize the problem. And so if that then is the kind of the common sense of education, then let's see how that translates into policy. Because there are so many people who want to say, like, let's say, Michelle Rhee, the former chancellor of DC Public Schools, super popular with many reformers, with many people. Why? Because she went up there and she sort of capitalized on this commonsensical way of thinking about education. She went up there and she said, schools are failing. And they're failing because we have too many lazy and incompetent teachers. So what am I going to do? I'm going to come in and save schools by getting rid of the lazy and incompetent ones, right? And by the way, if that sounds kind of like simplistic and nonsensical, that is kind of the philosophy that drives school reform today, right? It is about holding individuals accountable. The whole testing and punish regime that is defined by, that is fleshed out by federal policy is all about this. It's all about saying, what's going to make things better? Let's hold individual teachers and leaders accountable. So we have things like merit pay. Right? How do we improve schools? Let's measure student performance. And if student performance goes up, that means the teacher is doing well, so they should get rewarded. And let's take that even one step more with how we regulate teacher preparation programs. The federal government last year, a year and a half ago, put out this proposal for how they wanted to regulate all 20,000 programs across the country that prepare teachers. And this is what they said. How do you measure learning? You look and see where the test scores have gone up. And test scores will go up if there's a good teacher in the classroom. So how do we evaluate teachers? We look at where the test scores go up. And how do we evaluate the universities that prepared those teachers? We look at whether their student test scores go up. So the teacher preparation regulation said that universities should track your graduates for 3 years. And if in those 3 years the test scores go up, that means that is an effective program. And if it is not, then you should lose federal funding for student financial aid. This is the proposal, right? And there's no expectation that this proposal will not become the reality before the election, before the next president comes in. So what's interesting is that when this was proposed a year and a half ago, there are many teacher educators, professors like myself, who responded. And here's what people were saying when they responded. The measurement of student learning should not be done only by looking at tests. So let's look at a whole portfolio of student learning as a way to get a more complex picture of what's happening in the students' minds. But does everyone see that whether you look at gains in test scores or you look at a portfolio, you're still buying into the same story that the way you evaluate teachers is you look at individual output. And the way you evaluate universities is you also look at individual outputs. What I would argue is that what makes for effective teaching is not simply the teacher. The notion that it takes a village to raise a child is the shift that we need to be making here. It's not about individual accountability. It is about villages or systems, right, working synergistically and collectively to educate children. So how do we evaluate teachers? It should not be on whether test scores go up. It should be on how are they contributing to the larger system. The system within schools, the system community-wide, right? In other words, the shift that we need to be making is away from this kind of competitive notion of we need to prepare people to be competitive in the global marketplace. We need to have the best school system in the world. One time I was talking to a teacher who said, I didn't sign up to beat out everyone else. That's not why I became a teacher. I became a teacher because I want to kind of create spaces where young people can flourish and succeed and be happy in the now and in the future. And I would argue that's why many of us become teachers. Not to be the best in the world, not to beat out everyone else, but to think about the education and the wellness of the children sitting right in front of us. We need to shift from the idea that education is all about being the best in the world to education is about it takes a village. And what does it mean to strengthen that system? My last point is about shifting from debating policies to demystifying ideologies. So let's return to the one thing that I said characterized the similarity between Trump and Clinton, and that is school choice. So I want to talk about choice, by talking about where did school choice as a policy originate. And I want to go to a slightly unlikely suspect, which is international economic policy. So let me talk a little bit about this, tied in with the civil rights movement, tied in with education policy. Okay? So after the Cold War, after World War II, as we were entering the Cold War, the US economy began to be increasingly influenced by a group of thinkers out of the University of Chicago, right? And it was people who were putting forward the argument that the way you build a stronger economy is you deregulate, right? You force competition. You try not to have big government come in and control what the economy looks like. It goes back to the idea that competition is going to make people work harder, and when people work harder and be more innovative, they're going to get better. Right? So free enterprise, free market, this was becoming the new way of thinking about what our economy should be looking like. And it drove international policy. The US very quickly gained dominance in the global financial institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and things like that. So in the 1940s, but mainly 50s and 60s, as nations around the world entered fiscal or financial crisis, they would turn to these global financial institutions. And the institutions would say, we'll help you out of your crisis. In other words, we'll give you big money if you immediately deregulate your markets, if you move into what some were calling a free market economy. Now, what the rhetoric would have us believe is that this kind of deregulation would strengthen the economy, meaning it would be better for all. But there's lots of evidence that those who are pushing for these changes knew that that really wasn't what we were pushing for. That a strengthened economy wasn't about everyone doing well. Strengthening the economy was actually about being able to consolidate wealth in the top, right? And so this is what happened. Look at books like Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine, right? Or Chalmers Johnson, well, much of what he writes, right, is about sort of tracking these kinds of changes that say nation after nation, within years of so-called deregulation, saw greater amounts of poverty and greater amounts of concentrated wealth in the 1% than before, right? It exacerbated the wealth gap in these countries, and it greatly exacerbated poverty. And by the 1970s, this became so common as a policy that it was driving not only economic policy, but educational policy. So by the 1970s, the global financial institutions were telling nations, you not only need to change your economy, like to kind of move towards deregulation, you also need to change your educational system. So Latin American countries, right, in the 1970s were known for having almost universal literacy rates, right? It had the highest literacy rates in the world. And again, within only a few years, we saw not only the economy collapse, we saw the literacy rates plummet, right? And this should not be surprising. If you marketize an education system and you're fostering competition, that means there are going to be winners and losers. That's what it means to be in a competition. And so why would we then expect that the educational system will not look like that as well, right? This became so dominant as an ideology, as a way of thinking about the world, that it began to shape many other sectors in the United States. In other words, it was not just driving economic foreign policy, it was also driving social, kind of domestic policy. And it was driven forward by what emerged in response to the civil rights movement, which is the conservative movement. So think again about when was kind of this kind of financial policy being hoisted around the world. It was the 1950s and 60s. It was the middle of the civil rights movement. And it was the early 1970s that we begin to see the seeds being planted for what would become the conservative revolution in this country, right? Things like in 1971 and 1972, the formation of things like the Philanthropy Roundtable and the Business Roundtable. These were the top wealthiest people in the nation saying, for several decades, a social movement has succeeded at changing law, right? That's what happened. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, by the way, is the period that historians in education called the federal era. And why is it called that? Because that's when the federal government became incredibly influential in public education in this country, right? It was leveraging federal funding to push schools to better comply with non-discrimination laws, with civil rights legislation, right? So what people saw was that social movements can change policy and law. And so we began to see the beginning of this network that would become the conservative movement. Think tanks, foundations, advocacy arms, media arms, right, were all being created. And it became so commonsensical as a way to think about economic and other reforms that we came up with a name for it. By the 1980s, it was being called the Washington Consensus. Why was it called that? Well, it was because both Democrats and Republicans were buying into the story that the way you improve a system is you marketize. Okay? So this is neoliberalism, right? Deregulation, kind of encouraging markets, encouraging competition as a way to drive system improvement. So neoliberalism is a frame to counter the civil rights movement, and it plays out also in education. So here's where choice comes in, right? So let's talk a little bit about desegregation. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, Supreme Court case that kind of said this, segregation is illegal. Okay, desegregation didn't happen for about 10 years. Desegregation really didn't begin in this country until 1964 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Why? Because the Supreme Court case just said, try your hardest. That was the Supreme Court case, right? It basically said, with all deliberate speed, right? As fast as you can, try to make this happen. It was the Civil Rights Act that tied federal funding to compliance, and that's what began to desegregate schools, okay? There are many who were saying, maybe we don't need, though, mandatory desegregation programs. And what was the policy of choice that people were saying we should move towards instead of mandatory desegregation programs? It was school choice, right? Because people were arguing, with school choice, we don't need mandatory programs, because here's what's going to happen. It doesn't matter what your racial background is. Everyone is going to want to get into the top schools. If you have a school choice program, the competition is actually going to naturally desegregate schools. Okay, well, what we saw, of course, is that it did not naturally desegregate schools, and that competition or choice programs can sometimes increase segregation. But my point is that choice was in many ways a neoliberal response to desegregation. History of vouchers. Vouchers also arises at around the same time in the 1970s, right? And vouchers has a very interesting history because we actually have a paper trail for people who are talking about the beginning of the vouchers movement. So think about, again, what's happening in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. 1965 is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It is the first major piece of federal legislation, and there's a lot of money now being directed towards public education. Throughout the 60s and 70s is called, 50s, 60s, and 70s is called the federal era, right? Again, a lot of legislation that's tying federal funding to compliance with anti-discrimination laws. It's having a huge impact on education. 1979 is the creation of the Federal Department of Education. It's no longer just an office, it's a department. I've now pointed to a number of things that shows a huge investment by the federal government into public education. What many people were seeing, in other words, was the creation of a massively expensive domestic enterprise, public education, right? So it's in this context that vouchers emerge, because there are economists who are arguing that we should not have this socialist system that is being created called public education. What we should actually do is privatize this system, and the best way to privatize was vouchers. Vouchers isn't actually privatizing, but the argument was that vouchers would open the door to privatizing, okay? So this continues today. What continues today is this idea that the markets are going to solve all of our problems. And this is why it's not surprising that both major candidates from the two political parties are in support of expansion of choice and charter schools. Now, there are other histories we can point to around choice and charter schools, but I'm just giving you one history. But I think it's an important one to keep in mind because it's one I think we often forget. We sometimes get so fixated, in other words, on debating a policy that we forget that underlying these policies is certain political ideologies. And it's the ideologies that we need to really be tackling if we want to see social change. Social movements don't tackle policies. Social movements are powerful because they shift consciousness, they shift ideology, right? What else is marketizing schools? Well, alternative routes to certification, right? The idea that universities shouldn't be the only one certifying teachers to teach, so let's create all these other ways for people to become teachers, right? And then the competition will make teacher preparation even better. Race to the top is perhaps the best example maybe not best, it's like the exemplar of what it is that I'm talking about, right? Of fueling competition, moving away, in other words, from formula grants that target high needs into competitive grants, right? That actually fuel privatization. You know what you have to put in your race to the top application? It's how you're going to outsource in order to spend a massive amount of money in a very short period of time, right? The Washington Consensus, it exists even today in education, and hence the agreement on choice. As with the newest reauthorization of the education law, so I said in 1965 we created this big law. It's called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It's reauthorized almost every decade, right? And the latest was No Child Left Behind under George Bush, 2002. Well, 2001. Then we had this long break. And at the end of last year, we reauthorized again. It's now called the Every Student Succeeds Act, right? What's interesting about the Every Student Succeeds Act is, if you think about what I was saying is the history of this law was 1965. It was created not only in the middle of the civil rights movement, it was also created in the middle of the war on poverty. This was a war on poverty legislation, right? It was created, why? It was created to enable or empower the federal government to push states to comply with civil rights legislation. It is part of what's called the federal era laws. In fact, it kicks off this whole series of laws that would happen in the 60s and 70s that is all about leveraging federal funds to force states to comply and districts with civil rights legislation. So what the law does, however, in this newest instance, is it weakens the federal government. In fact, when you talk to people about the Every Student Succeeds Act, they will say that one of the major pieces, one of the major shifts that this law has made happen is it pushes a lot of decision-making authority from the federal government to the states. And there's a reason why, right? Congress, both political parties, were just very unhappy with a lot of the Obama-Duncan kind of policies, right? Particularly requiring all this testing, right? A lot of people are just sick of the testing. And so what was the response of the Congress? It was to come up with a law that says the Department of Ed should not be so powerful anymore. Well, that's not a good what kind of solution is that? Like, what we actually should have done was come up with a better policy rather than to weaken the federal government, right? So we can do what I just did with choice, right? We can take a policy initiative and kind of deconstruct it in a number of different ways by asking some very kind of critical historical questions. So take, for example, testing. Testing is one of these issues that drives policy today, right? We seem to, if I were to name one of the commonsensical ideas that define public education today, it's the idea that test scores should tell us everything we need to know. The whole school turnaround movement is all about test scores. Teacher merit pay, it's all about test scores. Regulating teacher preparation programs, it's all about test scores. We seem to think that test scores should give us the research, the data that we need to make all of these big decisions, right? So let's ask some questions about that, which I won't answer now, but I'll tell you some of the questions that I think should be asked, and they are being asked, which is things like, when did mass standardized testing emerge? And where did it emerge? And what social movements or pseudoscientific movements might it be linked to, right? Everyone's aware that mass standardized testing has much links to eugenics and kind of racial categorizations, right? Why is it so compelling? Why is both Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals buying into the story and putting forward ideas, putting forward policies that buy into the story that testing should tell us everything? Well, it's because there's something about the story we're buying into around testing that is incredibly compelling. And what is that story? It is a neoliberal story about the individual, right? Holding people accountable, being able to measure improvement, right? What's its impact? What is the impact of test-based reforms? The interesting thing about the Arne Duncan legacy, or the Arne Duncan administration, is that we had all the data we needed, right? From his time in Chicago before he became the Secretary of Education. We knew what the impact was of the school turnaround movement. We already saw it in Chicago, right? He sailed through the confirmation hearing, It was a very easy, lovely confirmation hearing, right? No one did their homework to see if you made that Chicago policy writ large, what would happen? Well, what we've seen happening, which is the widening of the opportunity gap in this country, is exactly what we could have predicted, right? So, a lot of these policies, like test and punish policies, like fueling competition or neoliberal policies, actually serve to even more efficiently sort students. And so this then is my final point. When we analyze reforms, we need to be contrasting the rhetoric with the reality. We need to be looking at how we talk about the purpose versus what is actually the function. We often talk about the purpose of education as being about equal educational opportunity or leveling the playing field or preparing everyone for success. That's how we talk about the purpose, right? Well, what is the reality? The reality is that schools have never really functioned in that way. As Dave was talking about earlier, schools, public education in this country was never created for everyone. It was created in its earliest instances for the elite. And as we are forced to integrate more and more, we just came up with more and more ways to divide and sort them, such as through segregation, such as through tracking, such as through testing, such as through arguably many other kinds of reforms underway right now. The purpose might be equal educational opportunity, but the function is to sort. And those of you, by the way, who do kind of international comparative education, one of the kind of centerpieces of this entire field is looking at how mass education functions in nations around the world. And when mass education, particularly in industrializing nations, were created, what was their function? Was it equalizing the playing field? People were very explicit. It was about socialization. It was about sorting, right? So sometimes I have this conversation and people are like, oh, that's kind of depressing. Maybe we shouldn't have a public education system, right? And I would say, although the function of public education has long been to sort, that is not reason to give up on public education, right? To me, as many have argued for decades, public schools is and should be a site of contestation. It is precisely where we as a nation struggle over defining who we are and what we want to become. It is where we grapple as a nation or a community or a society over what our ideals should be and how to bring them into reality. This is why education is so worth the struggle. This is why we need social movements that can rally around a new vision for education. So let's return then to the title of my talk. Yes, we do want to think about what a new president can build, but a new president alone cannot build. Many people have talked about the legacy of Barack Obama. One of his greatest struggles is he did not work synergistically with movements in the way that some of these other presidents that I've talked about have done. And arguably, none of the top candidates do that either, right? The one candidate who was tapping into a very left populist movement, Bernie Sanders, had an interesting history or contest with the Democratic Party, right? Where the Democratic Party actually eschewed the candidate and as a result eschewed the movement. Now, what's interesting about the studies of these former presidents is that they didn't get elected by these movements. None of them were. They were successful because they tapped into the movements while they were president. There is no vibrant social movement right now around education that is pushing for the kinds of systemic ideas that I'm talking about. We are a very fractured group, right? And this is why even if I were to become the next Secretary of Education, I would still need a vibrant movement behind me, with me, and in front of me to articulate that vision and to make that vision a reality. So these are the questions and challenges and opportunities I urge us to grapple with as we engage in this important work, and I hope that this presentation helps in that effort. Thanks very much.
Well, again, everyone, just as a reminder, a group of young folks who call themselves the Movement for Black Lives, also references Black Lives Matter, ask folks to imagine a world where you operated from what they refer to as a black queer feminist analysis. Now, what does that mean, right? So that recognition is that we live in a world that has positioned itself as anti-black since the arrival of Africans to the shores of the Western Hemisphere. Now, in the reversal of that, the claim to our dignity, the claim to our humanity is one that is rooted in not a space that's saying we want to sit next to folks, but that we will claim the dignity. Patrick Kamayan, faculty here, always reminds us around what is a solidarity of the global South? What is the recognition of dispossession, and how do you specifically commit yourself to take back what has been stolen from you? Now, I doubt if we're gonna get that from any Secretary of Education, right? But in the same time, always remember the struggle for education has always been a freedom struggle. James Anderson in the history of education of blacks in the South says it is impossible to understand the freedom struggle for education without a specific understanding of the ways in which white supremacy permeates the United States, right? We cannot do it, right? And let me be clear, white supremacy, not a bunch of old white dudes around a table saying this is how we're gonna get them. But to Kevin's point around ideology, the views and values of white, able-bodied, Western European-descended, Christian, hetero, cis men as normal, right, and good, and everything else being othered, right? So if we understand that particular framing, then we can do stuff a little bit different, right? So Kevin's challenge to us is one that is both at the ground level and one that is writ large. But when I hear my students challenge me on this, and they say, Doc, look, if we can't get it, we're gonna make sure this gonna be hard for anybody else too. And I say to myself, that sounds real similar to 50 years ago, and a claim to human dignity. So now, in our solidarity, dare we say that word now, with them, in our support of them, what are we willing to do, right? So Kevin has offered us a challenge, right? What are we willing to do, and how, if movements bring about social consciousness, then how do we respond and support those spaces that are challenging us to rethink how we operate, if that's making sense, right? And let's be real, that's hard work, right? But right back to our classroom space, the teachers who committed themselves to you always knew that a struggle for freedom was always extra work, right? Now, they didn't come to you and say, as a fifth grader, I want you to engage in liberatory praxis, right? But what they did say to you sometimes was, I'm much less concerned with this thing, school, but I'm much more concerned about you being able to make a larger decision in a world that hates you. Right? A fourth grade teacher told me that. So now, how do you bring about love and healing in a place permeated on hate? And this is a different question, because when we think about movement work, we very rarely discuss love. Right? We think about it as some flighty thing, right? But a revolutionary love is a revolutionary responsibility, right? To reclaim what has been taken, our ability to care for ourselves. So now, if we engage this, we got work to do. And in that work, let us be clear that it's contested. And that contestation, I would argue, and many folks in this room would argue and have proven in their classroom space and in grassroots movement efforts, these are the things that move us forward, right? I'm gonna stop running my mouth. We're gonna take some questions, and then we're gonna go so you all can meet some of the candidates, see what they're talking about, see in which ways you can hold them accountable, right? And that thing around understanding what this next bit of work here is in the Bay Area. Please join me again in thanking Dean Kumashiro. And the University of San Francisco, get yourself something to eat, and we're going to be out here in the lobby. All right.